My name is Čeněk Pýcha and I'm working for the Institute of Information Science and Librarianship at Faculty of Arts, Charles University in Prague. I consider myself also for a memory scholar who is interested in the interplay of different memory layers and patterns, especially in public space. I was working also like teacher trainee and I was developer of some educational applications. In this project, Making Visegrad Histories Digital, I have been acting as an advisor and expert in public space. My colleagues developed two learning activities for Historiana, and my task now is to offer some concept and a broader context regarding public space in the context of post-socialist countries. My primary historical focus is Czechoslovakia and mainly the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. But I will also offer some Polish and Hungarian examples and also Slovak examples, and hopefully the offered methods and concept can be applied to the whole Central and Eastern post-socialist Europe or post-socialist countries. Regarding heritage preservation, the context of new socialist cities or in the context of new socialist order is quite interesting because the utopias should be future-oriented and heritage preservation is really connected with past. But despite that fact, there were built new buildings also, for example in Prague, this case of Bethlehem Chapel in historical style. So why? And I think that that the reason is that also for a communist ideology was important to reinterpret the past and to offer some new examples, and especially for a communist movement in Czechoslovakia, this long tradition of class struggle. It was in Marxist interpretation class struggle already during the 15th century, so it was important for them. So in the first part of my paper, I will present public space as a concept in the context of post-socialist countries. I understand public space as one of the key environments where history not only takes place, but also where history is imprinted. It's the traces of memory that will be extreme interest of us. Every political regime builds public space in its image according to its own ideology. Particularly in the case of the totalitarian regimes in the 20th century in Europe, the desire to control the public space was enormous. However, it was never completely successful. There were always previous layers in the public space, and we are equally interested in what remains of totalitarian regimes in the public space today. It is overlapping of layers that is extremely interesting to us and can create an interesting position from which to inquire about the past. And that is something what we want to share also with our students. The past in public space can arouse curiosity to provoke cognitive uncertainty, and confronting sides of memory can produce an eye-opening effect. So for this part, I prepared some examples of totalitarian spaces, if we can call it this way. As an example of an attempt at total domination of space, we can mention Albert Speer's Germania. That was ambitious architectural project plan as the new capital of Nazi Germany, intended to symbolize the grandeur of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Speer, Hitler's chief architect, envisioned a complete transformation of Berlin into this monumental city. The design included vast public spaces such as the Great Hall, Volkshalle, a massive domed building capable of holding 180,000 people, and the wide north-south axis lined with enormous structures, creating an imposing atmosphere meant to express the regime's power. Fortunately, this plan was never carried out. What is important to us is to ask, why is it so interesting to take into consideration space in post-socialist countries? Regarding Eastern Bloc countries after the Second World War, it's necessary to take into consideration the post-war atmosphere and specific conditions of the new beginning that was really influential. It was not only the countries of the Eastern Bloc that became places where utopias and new ideals were to take place. At this point, I would like to recommend a project of my colleagues that is called Victor E. Frames of Reconstruction, Realities and Visions of Recovering Europe, documentary film in post-visual culture. In the presentation, you can see the link and the website of this project, and I really recommend to see the documentary films where the atmosphere of new beginning and reconstruction is circulating in the whole Europe. Cities in Eastern and Central Europe under the rule of communist parties became the utopia of the workers' movement. And now I would like to present some examples of new cities or part of cities in Central Europe. Nová Huta, that is on the outskirts of Krakow in Poland, is perhaps the most famous examples of socialist urbanism in Poland. Construction began in the late 1940s as a self-contained city surrounding a massive steel mill. Nová Huta exemplifies socialist realism with its spacious avenues, monumental architecture, and planned green spaces, reflecting the era's ambition to create an ideal living environment for industrial workers. Ostrava Poruba. This district in Ostrava was built in the 1950s and is renowned for its characteristic socialist realist style, again featuring monumental buildings and wide boulevards. Ostrava Poruba was designed as a model housing estate for workers and steelworks and mines, aiming to create an ideal environment for the working class with extensive green areas and public facilities. A similar example is Havířov, but the difference is that Havířov was really a new city. Havířov is one of the largest post-war housing projects in Czechoslovakia, designed to accommodate miners and their families working in Ostrava region. Planned as a new town with a distinct socialist realist style, it later shifted to more functionalist architecture, so we can see also the development in architecture. The development included not only residential blocks but also cultural and public facilities meant to foster a socialist community life. Quite specific, and I really like this case, is the case of Most in the northern part of Czech Republic. Most, located in Czech Republic, is a striking example of socialist urban planning that transformed the area in the 1960s through the 1980s. Following the decision to demolish the original city due to extensive coal mining, a new town was constructed nearby to house workers from the mining and industrial sectors. The new Most features large-scale panel housing blocks, wide streets and ample public amenities designed to create a modern, self-sufficient living environment for its working-class residents. This urban renewal project was symbolic of the era's ambitions to reshape entire cities in line with socialist ideals. What is interesting is also the heritage preservation in Most, because the whole really old city was destroyed here, but there were some sites that were preserved. One of these sites is the church that was moved, and it's really interesting case. I really recommend works of Matěj Spurný and Igor Gleisheim in this case, who are scholars. And they are historians, and they are comparing also Most with other cities and other projects. Igor Gleisheim even in Canada and in the United States, and he is thinking or he's saying that this way to use the environment or to misuse the nature for mining. It's not only thing of the socialist countries, and it's also experience that is sharing also in the global perspective. So let's go back to examples we presented. To some extent, these ambitious projects were a continuation of the modern concept of architecture, in which the functions of public space were to be clearly defined. These projects showcase a shared vision in Central Europe during the socialist era, with each district designed to promote a collective lifestyle and provide comprehensive housing, cultural and social facilities for the working class, as we have seen in all the cases we presented. But in totalitarian regimes, modernity took a really extreme form. However, the communist utopia in public space did not only apply to newly built or renovated cities. Historic towns, including the largest and capital cities, were also gaining their socialist face. Here some historical traditions were interestingly combined with the new socialist order. In the Czechoslovak context, for example, there was a link with the Hussite movement, and in Prague there was even a newly built Bethlehem chapel where Jan Hus, the central figure of Hussitism, preached in the 15th century. So we can ask here, does it make sense? Because we cannot connect utopia or the communist utopia that was future-oriented with the past. So why the communist regimes why was so important for them to reinterpret the past, and maybe that is also the answer, to find also the connection to the past and to some historical interpretations that already even in the 15th century the Hussites were part of the class struggle. In large cities, socialist utopia was most often inscribed in public space in the form of monuments and memorials. Monuments will be elaborated in more depth in the next chapter of this lecture, but in general it can be said that the monuments most tangibly materialize ideology in public space. Also from a didactic and educational point of view, monuments can be considered very suitable sources for teaching, precisely because they are directly involved in the articulation of ideology in public space. Concepts. In this part, I would like to offer two main concepts that allow me to work with traces of memory in contemporary public space. Maybe the biggest authority in memory studies is French historian Pierre Nora, who defined the key concept of lieu de mémoire, that is sometimes translated as sites of memory, and sometimes it's translated into English like realms of memory. It differs what you are stressing in the concept. I would like to quote from his key work. Lieux de mémoire are simple and ambiguous, natural and artificial at once, immediately available in concrete sensual experience and susceptible the most abstract elaboration. Indeed, they are lived in three senses of the word: material, symbolic and functional. Even an apparently poorly material site like an archive becomes a lieu de mémoire only if the imagination invests it with a symbolic aura. A purely functional site like a classroom manual, a testament or a veterans reunion belongs to the category only in as much as it is also the object of a ritual, and the observance of commemorative minute of silence, an extreme example of a strictly symbolical action, serves as a concentrated appeal to memory, be literally breaking a temporal continuity. Moreover, the three aspects always coexist. From this quotation, we can legitimize the way we are approaching memory in public space. We are interested especially in physical traces of ideology. The monuments, for example, also had their important position in public space because of their symbolical meaning. We can see them as a proof of how was constructed communist ideology in public space. But we must also not forget that specific cultural practices took place around the memorials, both at the level of celebration and their everyday functioning in public space. It is the everyday movement in the city that leads us to another authority from whom I derive my approach, and that is Michel de Certeau and his work Practices of Everyday Life. Of particular importance to my interest in public space are the traces that remain in public space today after the communist regime. In my opinion, these traces create an opportunity for an educational perspective and education in public space. If we come across a trace while moving in the public space, it can create an excellent educational situation. Memorials and their legacy after 1989. As I mentioned before, excellent examples of reading ideology in public space are memorials. For our purposes, I divided the memorials in 4 categories, and I divided the monuments from our perspective now. We will be working with monuments that originated before 1989 during the communist era, but we are looking on them from our perspective now and after their legacy after 1989. The categorization is based on my previous research, and again it's focused especially on Czechoslovak examples, or maybe Czech than Slovaks, more Czech than Slovaks examples, but I think we can apply it also like in the broader context of the Central Europe. So the first category are guilty figures, dismantling monuments of former regime representatives. The most prominent statues of individual representatives of the communist rule quickly came under the hammer. They were no longer allowed to occupy public space, and they were removed quite soon after 1989. This concerned a number of statues of Klement Gottwald, for example, who was the first communist president of Czechoslovakia and who represented the Stalinist era of post-war Czechoslovak communism. Statues of Gottwald disappeared, for example, from Písek, from Brno, or from Most. We mentioned Most already before. Similarly, statues of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin that represented the Soviet influence on Czechoslovak history alongside many statues of Red Army soldiers were removed. The general consensus about the need to dismantle these kinds of monuments in the early 1990s reflects not only the anti-communist spirit of the regime change, but can be seen also as the result of an already longer process of ideological disillusionment in late socialist Czechoslovakia. These memorials were empty symbols for the majority of society even long before 1989. Despite some of these statues originated in 1980s. Special cases are the statues of Stalin, which are probably the most known examples of this category. These statues were torn down after the cult of personality criticism in 1953. Maybe the most known example is Budapest. A large statue of Stalin was erected in 1951 as a symbol of Soviet power and dominance in Hungary. However, during 1956 uprising in Hungary, citizens tore down the statue and they were leaving only Stalin's boot. This dramatic act became a powerful icon of Hungary's struggle for independence from Soviet influence. The second example is Prague. The statue of Stalin in Prague was unveiled in 1955, and it was the largest of its kind in the world, towering over the city on Letná Hill. However, it quickly became a symbol of oppression and fear during a time when Stalin's crimes were increasingly exposed. In 1962, Just 7 years after its completion, the statue was dramatically demolished by explosives, leaving behind only a reminder of a turbulent chapter in Czech history. That is interesting that the space there in Prague is still empty, and after 1989 it became a symbol of skateboarding because it was used by skateboarders for doing some tricks and so on. So it's interesting interplay of different layers in public space. It's also interesting to compare Hungarian and Czech approaches to the statues that were erased from public space. Memento Park. We knew Memento Park from Budapest, and it's an open-air museum that was opened in 1993, dedicated to Hungary's communist past, specifically its period under Soviet influence. Located on the outskirts of the city, the park displays statues, monuments and plaques that once decorated Budapest streets, all of which reflect the idols and figures of communism like Lenin, Marx and Hungarian leaders of the era. It was established to preserve these controversial pieces as historical artifacts rather than symbols of political ideology. In Prague, there is no museum directly dedicated to the monuments removed from public space, but some of the communist memorials were reinstalled in the Alšany cemetery near the Red Army burial site. So these memorials continue to tell the story of communism, but in a complete new context. And this is related to the other two categories I want to introduce here. The next category I called controversial figures dealing with ambivalent histories. While the question of responsibility or guilt of the wrongdoings of the past communist regime seemed easy to answer in the case of Gottwald and Lenin. The issue became more complex with regard to other statues as time went by. In the 2000s, several initiatives emerged that called for the rehabilitation of some historical individuals whose communist-era statues had been removed in the early 1990s. Among these more controversial former communist leaders were, for example, Julius Fučík, Jan Šverma or Jožka Jaburka. We are now concentrating just on the Czech context. The reason for the rehabilitation initiatives in all these cases was that these men and women had been involved in anti-Nazi resistance during Second World War, but on the side of Communist Party. They were fighters against Nazi regime and therefore became heroes for the communists after the war, who erected monuments in their memory. According to some Czechs or some parts of Czech society, they had been used by the communists, but in reality they simply represent one of the core dilemmas of post-communist coming to terms with the past in Central and Eastern Europe. The fact that among those who made great sacrifices in their fight against the Nazi occupiers were also those who staunchly believed in communism and its methods. Julius Fučík, a journalist who was an active member of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and of the anti-Nazi resistance and who was tortured and executed by the Nazis in 1943, is perhaps the most significant representative of this category of controversial figures. His statue in Stromovka Park in the Prague district of Holešovice, right next to the exhibition center, named also after Fučík, had been dismantled in 1990 and deposited. After heated debates, it was reinstalled in 2005 in a different part of Prague on the Alšany cemetery we mentioned before. Fučík's statue was unveiled next to the burial ground of Red Army soldier and other similar statues of persons who died in resistance to Nazism and were misused during communist rule, as Jan Šverma or Jožka Jaburkova. So that is an interesting paradox of moving monuments to a cemetery, because it represents a point of view that we cannot have these persons still in public space, but on a cemetery they can be reinstalled, and the communist history is reinterpreted in this context. So the Third category are Red Army memorials or Soviet War memorials. And this category, I would say, is quite similar to the figures or to the controversial figures I mentioned before. This kind of memorials can be found in almost every Czech city, also in Slovak cities, Polish and Hungarian cities, usually in form of a statue of an enemy's Red Army soldiers, or also sometimes the army technique is used as a memorial to approach a tank, for example. The approach that was taken by Czech authorities and citizens towards this memorial after 1990 differs from place by place. Some of the Red Army memorials disappeared or were radically altered in their appearance. An example of the latter is the memorial on form of a tank that stands in Prague, which was painted pink by the Czech artist David Černý in 1991. And it was really interesting discussion about this performance. Now the tank is not there anymore, but it's in military museum. Other memorials remained and were even renovated, like for example the monument in the center of Brno. Finally, some monuments were simply left alone to decay and are nearly forgotten today. The arguments in the public discussions about what to do with these Red Army monuments also differed. It depends on the locality and level of the misinterpretation for which concrete monuments was used before 1989. The major misinterpretation was that, for example, in some Czech cities were also these monuments in some Czech cities that were liberated by the American army. Some of those who argued for renovating monuments pointed to their artistic qualities. For example, this is the case of Brno. And the last category, and that is maybe the most interesting, are the working class monuments or memorials to working class. We can call it forgotten memorials. And I think that this category is quite absent in today's discussion. These are the monuments that officially remember the workers and fighters of the class struggle, especially during the interwar Czechoslovak Republic and during the economic crisis of the 1930s. Some represent the even more distant socialist history, as they refer to the beginning of the self-awareness of the working class in the second half of the 20th century. These were large work demonstrations back then, mostly in the more industrial regions of Czechoslovakia that were crushed by the police, causing several fatalities. These events became important part of the communist narrative pushed in order to legitimize communist rule in Czechoslovakia after 1945. Such narratives of class struggles also served as a source of alternative identity in those regions where Czech Germans had been expelled. And it is really interesting interplay. Put up mostly in the 1950s and 1960s, these memorials also played an important role in the construction of regional identities. This is perhaps why the majority of these monuments was not dismantled or damaged after 1999. To be sure, they were removed from the highest level of heritage preservation, but they remained there in the public space. Sometimes small modifications were made by adding to the text or by removing some of the more obvious ideological elements from monuments. Today these monuments are often in bad shape and the local authorities do not know what to make with them. In this category that I find most interesting from the point of view of contemporary communism remembrance, because it is closely related to the basic question: where is the borderline between memorialization of an event and ideological misuse of those narratives? Can this boundary be drawn anywhere at all? I think that attempting to categorize the way we relate to the communist past on the basis of memorials in public space can contribute to deeper understanding how we treat the past. And we can share this question also with our students and pupils during education. Memory in public space is not just about monuments and memorials. During the period of state socialism, public buildings were built, some of which are still in use today, which is different from most memorials, because we are not using memorials that were built during the communist era, especially they are linked to the communist reinterpretation of history. How do we relate to buildings that were built under non-democratic conditions but are still in use today? Also, the architectural value of these buildings is still disputed today. In the Czech Republic, for example, there have been many recent initiatives to save buildings built during the socialist period whose artistic value has been overlooked. For example, metro or underground, that is an interesting case, because the Prague metro can also be read as a symbolic structure that represented the history of communism in a contemporary perspective. The decoration of some stations were dedicated to Hussite movements, and some stations were named after important communist persons or politicians. At the same time, the metro was presented as a success of socialism when the communist state system was able to at least approach Western standards in the sphere of everyday life. Traces of socialism remain in decoration of the Prague metro to this day, even though the stations have been renamed. Again, this decoration may act as the aforementioned torso or trace of state socialism in public space. This is case, for example, Julius Fučík we already mentioned, and there was a metro station that was called Fučíkova. It is not called so anymore, but there is still a relief of Julius Fučík in the station. Socialist construction is not just about cities. Buildings in the style of socialism realism, as well as later modernist buildings, can also be found in small towns and even in villages. These were mainly cultural centers, railway stations or shopping centers. At the time of their construction, these buildings may have been a brutal intrusion into the historic built environment, but today they have become an integral part of towns, and some are even listed they are even listed under heritage preservation. How to approach them today? And block of flats, so that is really interesting. An important topic concerning public space is also social housing construction, especially in the form of prefabricated housing estates, as implemented mainly in 1970s and 1980s. Although in some cases these were complex urban projects, the reality of construction was primarily pragmatic. Residents who were the lucky ones in the competition for the allocation of flats in general shortage often complained about the lack of amenities or the neglected common public space. So let's compare it to the part about the utopia in the beginning. Yet, on some estates, artworks were created as part of the development. These works can still serve as witnesses to the specific approach of state socialism to housing. The prefabricated housing estates are the subject of several learning activities that we have prepared in the project, so you can deep dive to this topic there in these learning activities. What is really interesting for me is the interplay of the sites we discussed now with the memorials that represents our contemporary memory to communism, which mainly highlight the victims of the communist regime or the fighters for freedom and democracy. Are we able to understand this multiple voice in our public space?